workshop in our strategic proposal writing series, fall 2022. I see some really familiar faces and names here, so that's great. If this is the first time you're joining us in the series, welcome. My name is Tyler Carson. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And I'm joined by my colleagues today here at GradFund. Nama, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Nama Shunom, and I'm a PhD candidate as well, but I'm in the Graduate School of Education. And Ellen?
Hi, my name is Ellen White. I'm a PhD candidate in Planning and Public Policy. Nice to meet you all.
Great. So we'll jump right in. Before we get started, just a couple of quick notes. The webinar is being recorded, so just note that the breakout sessions won't be recorded. You're welcome to be on cam or off cam, up to you. You're welcome to unmute at any time in terms of like when we solicit feedback or at the end for Q&A and pose your question, or you can just post it in the chat if you don't feel like speaking up. All right. Also, we'll post a link in the chat. The School of Graduate Studies, which GradFund is falls under, is actively collecting data in terms of our student-facing kind of engagement and services. So we're posting a survey link in the chat, which you can fill out at the end. It would be really great to have some feedback as well, but also just as a formality that they're requiring. All right, so with that being said, let's jump in. So today we're going to be focusing on the research statement. And thanks for a few of you who filled out some questions that you had. You're welcome to pose those at the end if we don't cover anything that you had questions about during the workshop. It will be interactive, so just note that we have a few breakout sessions organized. And yeah, so the outline for today is we'll get into the what and why of applying, what you should think about before you begin writing. Then we'll get into more of the kind of intricacies of crafting a research statement, right? What its structure is, and then some tips and tricks. Towards the end, again, we'll have a Q&A, and you can pose any of your questions verbally or in the chat that you may have. All right, so the what and why of applying. So a typical application often has these set of components, right? And sometimes they'll be combined into some format where you might see two of these things, like the research statement and personal statement combined, but also they'll be separate quite often. Often you're required to submit transcripts, CV, letters of recommendation, or a budget if you have direct research expenses, right? So we've talked a lot about in other workshops the difference between what a fellowship and a grant is. A fellowship covers living expenses. A grant is one that covers research expenses. And so even in your research statement, the details are going to change a bit in terms of like what you're writing for, right? So if you're writing for a grant, you have to show that you have research expenses in terms of like your actual research that you're doing, right? Like the equipment or things that you need to visit, like archives. We'll get into that though, don't worry too much. So just some things to think about, right? In terms of like, you know, you made it here, which is great. Some of you may have applied for external awards before. Some of you might be thinking about it. And here are some reasons for why you should do that, right? So applying for external funding helps you gain practice at communicating your work and significance to interdisciplinary non-specialist audiences, right? So it's kind of like if you're going to go onto the job market at some point, either industry or academic, right? It's a really good exercise at translating your research to audiences that aren't necessarily going to be specialists in your area, right? So if you're in a PhD program and you have a dissertation committee, most of those members are going to be somewhat, if not very conversant in the specifics of the debates that you're engaging or the history of your discipline. If you're in a master's program, Sometimes you'll be forced to do this kind of translational, work around like communicating to non-specialist audiences, but often the Academy, as we know, is a very specialized place. So we have our own set of languages that we deploy all of the time. So learning how to translate and communicate your research, but also your interests and your experiences to other audiences is really important. You also get to acquire experience crafting application essays, right? And specifically, fellowship and grant applications are specific, or the proposal structure, as we call it here, is a specific kind of essay, right? It is different from your dissertation prospectus if you did one of those. It's a kind of genre onto itself. So learning early about this genre and gaining some experience working in this kind of essay format is important if you want to do this throughout your career, right? Because applying for external funding is one way to advance your career. And we'll get to that in a second. So clarify and articulate your understanding of your research goals and academic identity, right? We find that students really benefit from working in this genre because it forces you to really simplify and clarify your research interests, right? And what the project is about. If you can put in very simple terms what the stakes of the research are and why it's important, then likely you're often able to do that in more dense or nuanced terms, right? So it actually gives you a chance to go back and then really clarify those stakes. So you also can establish a track record of securing external awards, which will help you stand out to future employers and funders, right? One of those terms that you might have heard before is like money follows money, right? That's not to say that people just get these because they're these awards, right? These merit-based awards, as we'll talk about in a minute, because they're not worthy of them. But it's true that the more that you have behind you in terms of funders who have taken an interest in your research or your scholarly kind of abilities, the more likely you are to be appealing to future funders, right? You have a track record that is appealing to these funders, that they want to put their name behind you alongside these other funders. And finally, and this is like the most, probably number one reason, we're all in graduate school, we all have expenses, and we need that, cash flow in also to support us, right? So it's good to have this kind of opportunity to get funds. All right, so before you begin, actually crafting an application, right, you'll want to do a few things. And this is kind of like a preliminary literature review, if you want to say like a research pull in terms of data or theories when you start a project, right? So just like a research project, you want to start researching the funder and what their aims and missions are, and if you see an alignment between those aims and goals and your own research, right? So there needs to be a good, what we call in the funding world, fit between this topic of your research, its goals and aims, and the topic or the goals and aims of the funder, right? So what they're interested in supporting. You'll also want to look at the profiles of the past award recipients to look at that, to gain a sense of that fit, right? So have they funded research or applicants that have the same kind of profiles as you, right? And what kind of institutions do they come from, right? So is this award primarily funding public universities? Sometimes they'll have a preference for Ivy universities. So it's just good to have a sense of the type of applicants that they support. Thirdly, you'll want to gain a sense of what the review process looks like and who are the reviewers, right? So often funders will have a multi kind of stage review process, right? Where your work will be read by different kinds of reviewers at different points. And so it's important to understand, is this person going to be from my discipline who's reading my work? Are they going to be an academic non-specialist reader, right? So they might be in a different discipline, but still have a PhD. They might just be not have a PhD at all and be reading your work, right? So a good example of this is the PEO scholarship, which is designed to support women pursuing like higher education degrees, right? So graduate degrees. And often their readers will only have a BA or some kind of bachelor degree. So it's important to like gain a sense of what the audience will look like and how you're going to have to frame your research and write your research statement based off of those reviewers. And then finally, is there contact information for a program officer? So this is a really underutilized resource that all funding opportunities have. So funding opportunities can exist with a human behind them, right? And this human is responsible for administrating the award. And so each year, they move you through behind the scenes and slot you into these different kinds of application processes. One of those being often your discipline, when you select it, where that's going to be funneled to in terms of the reviewer, right? So reaching out to a program officer at a fellowship or an award opportunity is really good to confirm your fit for an award, to pose any questions you have, to get any information that might not be available on the public-facing website that they have, right? Something like the ratios of applicants to awards that they make per year. They might not share that information with you. They might say that we don't publish that. Often they will, though, right? If you ask. So these are all good steps to take before you start writing to give you a better sense of what is going to be in store for you as you begin writing this application for the award. Will better prepare you to be more strategic, right? That strategic part in the proposal writing of our title about crafting your research statement. All right, so now we're going to talk a bit about some major review criteria that comes from the National Science Foundation. These two categories of intellectual merit and broader impacts, but are fairly universal across all applications broadly, in the sense that these categories are helpful in thinking about the way in which we can think about review criteria generally. And so before we get into what these two categories are, or review criterion, we're just going to have you do a breakout exercise. So you're all going to be assigned into breakout rooms, and take a minute, introduce yourself to the room, your name, your program, what graduate degree you're pursuing, and try to discuss these two questions, right? So what do you think is the difference between intellectual merit and broader impact? And I know we don't have any definitions yet, so it's fine. You're guessing in the dark, right? Unless you're in maybe an NSF field, then you might have some experience with these kinds of awards or this language. And then secondly, what are some examples, once you come up with a definition of intellectual merit and broader impacts, that you could include in your scholarly biography, right? So, or in your research statement. Okay, so again, these are taken from the National Science Foundation. They're the criterion that they use across all of their applications to do a merit review, right? And so what's important to just think about before we even get into these two definitions is the idea of merit, right? And so merit is a really important concept to the fellowship world, because most of fellowships and grants are not based off of, some will have a financial need component, but unlike financial aid, they're based off of merit, right? So how do we judge or evaluate merit? These are two criterion that they use to judge merit, right? So the worthiness of the research or you as a scholar, and for an award, right? And so the first category is intellectual merit. And they define intellectual merit as evidence of your work's potential to advance knowledge and move your discipline forward, right? And so what does that mean? That means that it can mean many things, right? There can be a number of scenarios that you could demonstrate this through, right? Perhaps that's you're doing research that has very little history, right? That, you know, maybe you're excavating an archaeological site that no one has done before. Maybe you are bringing two bodies of literature together that haven't been brought together before, right? Maybe you are, you know, doing scientific research that that pushes a specific hypothesis that's controversial or something, right? So the idea is that you're advancing knowledge within your own discipline, right? And moving it forward. So it's not just a literature review. It's not just a kind of, you know, simplistic take, but rather it's doing something ingenious, right? And so what's important to understand about intellectual merit is that it's different from your research intellectual merit. So it's both your intellectual merit and your research's intellectual merit factors in, but in the actual research statement, right, we're looking at the researcher's intellectual merit. So next week, we'll talk about the scholarly biography, as we just alluded to, which is about you as an individual and what you bring to your research, right? But this week, we're just talking about the actual researcher's intellectual merit. This is where it gets confusing, though, because we have broader impacts. And so intellectual merit, right, is about the questions and the things that you're doing within your research that are pushing your field forward. Broader impacts is about the potential to benefit and contribute to the achievement of specific desired societal outcomes, right? So it's kind of like a scale question, right? Or we can think about it as like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this kind of research within the academy, right? And these questions are often very important to academics, but what is the relevance to the larger world, right? That exists outside and beyond the walls of the academy? Why should everyone care about this research, right? Beyond our little academic bubble that we often find ourselves in. And so this is broader impacts, at least according to the NSF, but I think it's helpful to use as a model for thinking about all kinds of kind of fellowship writing and the questions that we should be asking ourselves when we're thinking about why our research matters. And so this can be done, right, or demonstrated through through ways, right? So through the research itself, right? So if you're, you know, if you have a specific kind of aim in your research to actually, you know, create societal outcomes, that it could be demonstrated that way, right? It could be demonstrated through activities directly related to the research, right? So maybe, you know, you're working in the Arctic, but part of your research, you know, engages Indigenous communities in a particular way that includes them in the research project, right? So while that might not be a direct aim of the research, it's an outcome that benefits that community, you could make an argument, right? So that would be a tangential like benefit to the research. And so the third one is kind of related to that, right? So through activities supported by, but complementary to the project itself, right? And so maybe you're part of a research team that has a public-facing component to your research, right? Like you may go into K-12 schools and like do science kind of experiments with children or something. So all of these things factor into broader impacts of the research. And what's important is that the potential impact of the individual you on society and the potential impact of your research on society. So you're talking about why it's important, right? And what you bring to the table in actually conducting this research. So we can definitely have questions about this. We're going to do another breakout in a few minutes that will try to get you to evaluate intellectual merit and broader impact, and there'll be language in a proposal so you can evaluate it. But so just to sum it up, that's where we're going. But we'll get into some of the more things to think about in the application before we do that.
So when we're thinking about the application, let's just like step back for a second and think about where this research statement or research proposal sort of sits within the broader application. So typically, depending on what you're applying for and some of the specifics, you're not only going to submit a research statement. So as we've alluded to, there's going to be a personal statement or a scholarly biography and a few other different things. And it's useful to think about them as a cohesive application, not just, you know, a bunch of different things that you're writing, but kind of how do they fit together, and what is each one contributing? So the research statement tells something really important. What is the research that you're doing? But it goes alongside this idea of a personal statement or a scholarly biography, which, as Tyler was mentioning, talks about what you're bringing to the table. So like, how are you preparing this? Or how are you prepared to do this research? And what is the interesting lens that you're taking? Like personally, what are things that you're bringing to the table with it? And depending on the award, it's going to require other things like transcript, CV, letters of recommendation, and in some cases, a budget. And all of these are going to tell a different piece of the broader story of why should they give this award to you to do this research. So one thing to think about more broadly later is just how to make your research statement kind of go hand in hand with the other pieces of the application. So how can you bring up things that maybe you can allude to in other pieces, or how can you support what you're saying in your research statement through, for example, your CV applicate components, what your recommenders say, what you write about, or what kinds of things you highlight in your personal statement, or like what classes you've taken that you can highlight in your transcripts and so on. So let's get back to the kind of details of how to think specifically about the research statement. In terms of crafting the research statement. So a strong research statement or a strong proposal has a lot of different elements, but generally speaking, when you think about it, or when you're thinking about it as a whole, first of all, make sure that it's clear, it's concise, it's compelling, it's basically a rich, cool story of the interesting research that you're doing and why it's important. You also want to make sure that it conveys a concretely defined topic with a feasible scope. So, you know, you're a graduate student. You don't want to propose a project that's going to take you 25 years. That's not reasonable. And you also don't want to propose a project that's going to take you 3 months, because, I mean, especially if you're applying for something that's for the entire PhD, you have to think about what's the scope, and that'll also depend a little bit on the awards. Some awards are for smaller periods, some awards are for longer periods, but it's useful to make sure that the scope is feasible, but also that the topic is concrete. And I think that this goes back to what Tyler was saying right at the beginning about using this as a tool to understand your research better and to make sure that you really know the details of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So often what will happen is people will write sort of in the abstract about what they'd like to do, but no, you have to be concrete. What specifically is your plan, and what are you going to do? Kind of going along with the idea of scope, it has to fit your stage of study. So different awards are going to align with different stages of study. If you're very early in your PhD, you have to be planning ahead to what you're going to do in the next few years, and you have to think about your plan accordingly. If you're applying for an award, let's say at the very, very end of your PhD, you have to talk about the award accordingly, or you have to talk about your research accordingly, both in terms of how long things are going to take, what kinds of things you can expect to be doing, and also in terms of level of concreteness. You know, your plan as a first year is likely to change. I think we've all been there. You come in with a vision and things, you know, adjust. Whereas like in your last year, probably there won't be that many changes anymore because you need to really make sure that you're just wrapping things up. Another thing is you have to make sure that you fit well with the funder's goals. So this has to do with, reading through the funder's website, making sure you know them well, and making sure that you're highlighting features of your research that align well with what it is that the funder is trying to fund and what they're interested in. And related to that, it has to be free of jargon and accessible to a broad audience. And what that means is going to depend a little bit on the award. So if you are, let's say you're doing research in organic chemistry and you're applying for an organic chemistry award, chances are you can write with some language that aligns with that your readers are going to understand that. Whereas if you're applying for, say, as Tyler was saying, like the PEO, where people who are reading it are probably not going to have graduate degrees, let alone graduate degrees in your field, you have to make sure that you're writing in a way that they will understand what you're writing about. So I think that that's a key thing, is really, it goes together with the idea of understanding your funder and understanding the review process. So let's look at the structure of the proposal. So this isn't a hard and fast rule, but it will give you kind of a general picture of what kinds of things to be looking for and how long to spend on them. So typically a proposal will have about short introduction, maybe 5%. And then another 5% should be about your research question or your objective or your hypothesis, basically making it really clear, not just generally speaking what your goal is, but very specifically, what do you want to get out of this? Then you get into kind of like the details, the kind of meat of this, and that's the background and significance. So you should spend about 20% of the space writing about why this is relevant, basically situating it in the literature, and talking about, what's the state of your field right now and how you're going to be moving it forward. Then spend about 50% of the space on the research itself. What is your plan? What's your research design? How are you going to be doing things? And again, the level of detail and complexity is going to depend on the award and the reviewers. So if you're, doing research on developing a particular medication and you're applying to the National Institutes of Health or something like that, then maybe you want to be more detailed about the methods you're using. If you're doing something a little bit more general, you want to spend more of that time talking in broader terms. And then you should spend about 10% talking about preliminary work or any research preparation that you've done. So for example, any preliminary data that you have or analyses, basically work that you've done that that this project is going to be building on or developing. And about 10% talking about the project time frame. So when are you going to be doing what? And note that these are going to depend on the application. Some of these elements might be addressed in other statements, like a personal statement. Some of them will have a specific page that's only for the time frame, and so then you won't have to talk about it here. And also some of these can be sort of built in together. In some cases, you might want to explain your time frame and build it into your research plan and design. Like, I'll be doing this piece at this time, and then I'll be doing this piece at this time. So it doesn't necessarily have to be in exactly this order. And of course, you don't have to be so exact by counting words and making it exactly 10% or exactly 5%. But this should just give you a general idea of about how much space to allot for each piece. So now that most of you have met each other in your breakout rooms, we are going to do another breakout room that's going to kind of putting all of this into practice. So we're going to go back into great breakout rooms and talk about, you're going to see in the chat we're going to put in a link to a document with some proposals. They're not super long. Just read them together with your group and talk about what elements do all these proposals share. So do you see any kind of structural patterns across the different proposals? So what do things kind of look like in these in these different proposals? And what elements are different about the proposals? So don't think about so much about content. They're all going to be from different fields. Think more about the structure. And we'll be back in probably about 10 to 15 minutes, and see you soon. I heard some really interesting things in the breakout rooms that I saw. It sounds like you have some really interesting ideas. Just for the sake of time, because we don't want to keep you too long, I'll just talk about a few areas to kind of ways to think about proposal structure and kind of relevant, important areas to discuss. We're going to have another breakout room later, and then when we kind of come together after that one, we can talk about what you noticed here and how that ties into what you do in the next breakout room. So thinking about proposal structure, we talked about all of these different elements, but let's kind of talk about what you might find in all of these elements, and then we'll tie it together into kind of this idea of different ways of structuring things. So just in terms of what you might include in your introduction, so you want to talk about, like, what's your topic? What's your main argument? And critically, you want to highlight, why is it significant? Which could in particular be things like, how is this going to move your field forward in some way? And very briefly, you'll expand on it later, but how will you do your research? And I think, as you might have noticed, some of these have it laid out very clearly. Like, there's a background section, there's a method section, and so on, which we'll talk about. And some of it have this written as part of like a broader narrative that goes through, like, from your background and then tying it into other areas. So let's think about how to talk about then your where you go from the background. And the key area is emphasizing a main question or hypothesis or goal. So this should be focused, concrete, and it should show the potential to contribute to your field. So sometimes this is going to be specifically a question. In some areas, in particular, I think in the first one that you saw, in the one about, with the picture of bats, this was in the case of this was a prediction. It was bolded, it was highlight or like underlined, and it really showed like this very specific question. But it doesn't have to be kind of that emphasized, and also depending on what you're applying for, that can be to your benefit because they allow for things like that, or to your detriment because they're really strict about bolding and highlighting and things like that. And you may or may not have a hypothesis. So like in the one that you saw with the echolocation, there's a very clear prediction. It's like, I predict this, and that's how it goes. But in other cases, it's kind of a more general question, or a kind of a slightly bigger look at the question that you're looking for. Then we're going to move into the idea of background and significance. So you highlighted what your point is, what your question is, but now you really have to talk more about why this is important. So this is sometimes known as like a literature review or a theoretical framework, but it's not going to be like the ones that you write about, say, in your dissertation or a journal article, because this is much shorter. You know, one of the key things is often you have very little space. You have maybe 2 pages, sometimes 5 pages. So each article that you cite, each additional piece of information is going to take up space, both inline and later in your citations. Often you don't get an additional page of, say, bibliography or citations. And so you have to kind of describe your field. You can cite the pieces that are most seminal to your research if needed, and it also will depend a little bit on the award. But the key thing is to kind of describe where your field is now. And then talk about the goals, design, and contribution of your research. And this is more on a theoretical lens. So you'll talk about more about the practical design, like the methodology, in your methods section. But this is an opportunity to talk about basically where your research sits within the literature or the current major theories in your field. And then talk about how you'll advance relevant discussions or debates in your field, or advance the knowledge in your field. So the key thing to think about is like, what's next for your field? Sometimes people talk about this as what are the holes in your field and thinking about filling them, but that also can have some limitations with respect to this idea that that like, what happens after you fill this hole? How are you going to go from there? So my suggestion is thinking about how are you going to move the field forward? What are the next key things that your field is going to do, and how is your research going to do that? And as usual, avoid the use of jargon. You might be really familiar with certain theoretical frameworks in your field, certain theories, certain major seminal findings, but you have to describe them in a way that your readers are going to understand. So that's either, you know, if your readers don't know anything about your field, describe them in a way that kind of general audience members are going to understand, or general readers. And if you're writing for people who are in your field, make sure that you write in a way that they will understand, even if they're not, you know, super familiar with your sub field. So now the key thing, you have to outline your research plan or design. So this will focus on the question of how are you going to collect evidence or data to answer your question or test your hypothesis. So this can be quite broad because it depends on what kind of research you do. You know, some research has to do with, you know, going to archives. Some research has to do with, you know, working with cells, isolating DNA or isolating like particular pieces of cells. Some research has to do with, you know, observing animals or talking with people. So this is going to be very specific to your field, but the goal is to explain what is your plan? How are you going to do it? If you're especially near the end of your degree, you might be applying for a writing fellowship, which is a fellowship to basically finish the writing of your dissertation. And so in those kinds of situations, you really want to make sure that you also highlight what work you've finished and what is remaining. So you can highlight what you've done in your research so far, and maybe what chapters you've started writing, and what is your plan for writing the next chapters. In setting the stage for, or kind of in supporting this, also talk about what preliminary work or preparation you've done. So, for example, what makes you well prepared to carry out the proposed work? In some cases, this will go also in your personal statement, but it's useful to think about because it depends on the award. Some of them will have it in your research statement. You have to talk about what you've done, for example, relevant coursework you've done, research you've conducted, or work experience you have. And some of them, it's going to go in your personal statement. So the idea is thinking about these elements all together and then figuring out which statements you need for the application and which statements it then goes into. This can also include things like publications, language or skills training, or key contacts that you've made. I would say many of those may go in an essay on previous research, or in an essay, or in a scholarly biography or personal statement. But one thing that you will definitely want to highlight in this research, or in your research statement, is any kind of preliminary data collection or analyses that you've done that are going to set the stage for the rest of the research that you're going to be doing. And finally, thinking through a timeline. So this should make sense in terms of the work that's needed to be done, as well as thinking through the timeline of the fellowship or the grant. So for example, if you're applying for a 1-year writing fellowship, you need to make sure that you're going to actually be done in 1 year as much as possible, or at least you have to give a timeline that outlines being able to finish in 1 year. You know, if you're applying for a 5-year research fellowship, you want to make sure that your timeline is outlining a project that's going to take around 5 years, not one that's going to take 1 year or one that's going to take 25 years. And so you want to think through the timeline of the application that you're writing, and use this as an opportunity to make the case for why the work needs to be completed and funded now. So this goes along with the idea of significance. The reality is there are many, many things that we don't know, that we are not that we haven't studied yet. So just make sure that you're thinking through. Oh, looks like we have some kind of a screen sharing issue, but that's okay. We'll sort it out in a minute. But in terms of timeline, just this goes along with the idea of significance. Make sure that it's clear what's important about this work now. There are tons of things we don't know. Why should we study? Why should you study what you're studying? And what's it going to bring to the field now? Is it, is it something that could have been studied years ago? Or is it something that that is being studied? Basically, how is this timely with respect to the field? Looks like everything is back in terms of screen share, which is perfect because it's just time to kind of go into another breakout room. So I believe we have something shared in the chat now ahead of time. So now you know it's another document. So you're going to see a research statement. It's for the NSF-GRF, and you're also going to see some review criteria or review elements. So think through, what does the research statement do successfully given what you've learned so far? And also, which of the 5 review elements does it address? Do you feel like it's addressing all of them really well? Do you feel like there's some areas that it could actually be addressing a lot better? And it's really short. And yeah, so go ahead, Tyler.
Just for context, the NSF-GRF is the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship. And so it's what we call like an early graduate career award. So it's in the first couple. You apply usually before you're even admitted to graduate school in your undergrad, or you don't have a completed master's degree yet, or you're in your first year of the PhD. So keep that in mind when you're writing. Some of you may be further along in your PhDs and have more sophisticated or kind of complex ideas about like what should be in a research statement. But this is targeted towards students who are at the early stages of their PhDs, if you're in a PhD. But yeah, with that being said, go for it, take a best shot. Again, just skimming, don't worry about too much detail.